Go, is that better? Oh, yeah, that's better. I just blew out somebody's computer speakers just now. So let's go ahead and jump into 1 Kings chapter 5. As you know, 1 Kings chapter 5 and 6 primarily deal with the building of the temple and just the descriptions we have of the temple and where the supplies came from and those types of things. Now, we know a lot of the supplies that were needed for the temple. Who did the work of gathering them? David. So we've already talked about that as we've gone through the story. David gathered together a lot of the materials, a lot of the workers, a lot of the things that were necessary in order to make it. But did he gather all of it? Clearly not. There was still a lot that needed to be gathered. There is some question as to this chapter 5 where King Hiram comes and he is offering that if that's not something, again, remember, where did David get all the lumber that he was gathering? King Hiram, and from Lebanon, and the cypress trees and the cedar trees that are there. And that, that's actually talked about in poetic form through the Psalms, the cedars of Lebanon, right? And just how amazing the trees were. So there's some discussion as to how much of this chapter 5 is really just like a continuation of what King Hiram has already been doing, that he just continues to send wood, that he essentially just tells Solomon, I'm going to give you this wood because I loved your dad. And Solomon, of course, works out the arrangement to do that. And so he sends to Solomon all of the cedar and cypress he wanted, which is a pretty impressive arrangement, right? And we do know that Solomon didn't just take it as a gift. What does Solomon do in exchange? Anybody pick up on that? Yeah. Basically, he sent him food. You can then, verse 9, you can then supply or meet my needs by providing my household with food. Makes you wonder how big was his household to offset the amount of wood that he was sending out. But Solomon does that. He sends him 100,000 bushels of wheat as food for his household and 110,000 gallons of oil from crushed olives. Solomon did this for Hiram year after year. And so essentially they just bartered for supplies. That's important because what is it seems to be the trend whenever you were building something for God, were you to take a gift to do that, or were you to pay full price for that? You paid full price, right? When Abraham needed land for the burial of Sarah, he paid full price for it. He wouldn't take it as a gift. When David needed an altar place for the Lord, he didn't allow it to be given. He paid full price for it. And so you have Solomon doing the same thing here, paying full price for the cedar. And then Solomon drafted forced labor. I love how it was worded that way, that he drafted forced labor. Like he pretty much enslaved a bunch of people. But he basically said, you're going to build this. And so he gets 30,000 men sent to Lebanon. He sends them in 10,000 number shifts, more or less. But he sends them out, and they go do the labor, cutting down the trees, dragging the trees back to Israel. But 30,000 men are involved in that effort. 70,000 porters, 80,000 stone cutters. He has 3,300 men that are deputies, basically managers, in charge of all the labor, making sure the labor gets done, making sure everything is done correctly. And that would have been a pretty significant job, because what do we know about the stones that were used for the temple? Where were they cut? Yeah, they had to cut them at the supply quarry, not at the work site. Would have been a lot easier to cut it at the work site, right? You've got the piece of, I'm bad about this. In building stuff, you're always told, I was told by an older man when we lived in Jasper, he said, measure thrice. I'd say he's an older man because younger men don't use the word thrice, but and he did. Literally, whenever we worked on a project together, Brother O'Rear, some of you might know him, he would He didn't use one of the rollout measuring tapes. He used one of the old fold-out wooden ones. Like, he didn't trust the metal ones. He was going to use his fold-out, collapsible wooden. Y'all know what I'm talking about? You don't see those anymore. And he would measure 3 times every time. But he never made a mistake. See, I go the younger person route, which is you cut it a little bit too big and then you shave it for a while until it fits just right. That works better for me because I can get a number wrong 3 times in a row, no problem whatsoever. So, the idea to me that you could take a measurement and you could go to a faraway distance and cut a piece of rock and not need to cut it again, not need to shave something off when you get to the place where you got to stick it in the hole, that's amazing to me. And especially considering they didn't have rollout measuring tapes or laser measurement devices or even the old wooden fold-out ruler. What did they have? Cubits. Now, again, they would create a measuring system for their project. Like, they wouldn't just go off of everybody's individual cubit because, smaller man's cubit is going to be a lot smaller than a large man's cubit. But they, still, you think about the fact that they're measuring at one location and then measuring in another location with nothing better than a cubit. That's flabbergasting to us. It's one of, and again, I think it's one of the misconceived ideas we have in our head that we're a lot smarter than people of past ages, and then we marvel at how they were able to build some of the things they build because we can't even figure out how they did it. Like the Easter Island heads, right? Y'all know what I'm talking about? Do what? Yeah, Stonehenge, how they got those rocks in place, the pyramids. The Eastern Island heads aren't just heads. They figured out that there's more to it underground, that they haven't dug them. I think they did dig one of them out, but there's whole bodies underground underneath the head. All we can see is the head, though, because that's what they left above ground. Think about that. Think about the amount of work that would go into digging the hole so that you could craft a statue so that you could cover it back up with dirt. The ingenuity and the engineering that was necessary to get those things done is amazing. And what's amazing to me about the temple is, where do we know some of the gifts of that ingenuity and engineering came from? God blessed them with it. So there are people involved both in the tabernacle back when it was constructed and in this case that God blessed their ability to get these things done, blessed the craftsmen, blessed them with the ability. And that, just all of that is it floors me. I'm amazed by it every time I look at it and go through a little bit of a study on it. It took the Israelites, the Lebanese people, and the Gabalites, all of them to prepare the building materials. And Solomon began this building project 480 years after the departure from Egypt. So, God has been dwelling in a tent for 480 years, or 479 years, if you subtract the time it took them to get to Mount Sinai. That's a long time to be in a tent, right? And to move a tent from place to place and do all the things that God did from that tabernacle. And so Solomon, of course, gets this project done. It says there in chapter 5, the temple that King Solomon built for the Lord was 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. The portico in front of the temple sanctuary was 30 feet long, extending from the temple's width, and 15 feet deep in front of the temple. Okay? So is that big? Not at all. I remember when I was a kid and I read those numbers, I'm like, wow. But that's not very big. It's taller than the average home that we look at these days, but as tall as some of the nicer homes in the area. But I mean, just as far as square footage, not a very large structure. Again, compared, we also look at this from the perspective of, imagine you were back then, what was the average size of the home? Itty bitty. I think Dallas's description a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about it was their entire homes could fit within most of our master bedrooms. Okay, so if those are the size structures you're used to, because those are the homes you live in, would this have seemed large? A lot larger than the average structure, okay? Now, again, not even going to compare to what we're going to see Solomon built for himself. So that, again, I'm not saying that to dismiss Solomon. I think Solomon does a good thing in building the temple and building it the way he does. But it is, they were familiar with larger buildings. This wasn't the largest structure they've ever seen. But again, it probably wasn't insignificant to them either, the way it would be to us. I remember the first time I saw a life-size replica of the tabernacle. It was up in North Alabama somewhere about 10 years ago. And I was like, that's it? Really? And that's what got me thinking of, I went back to the church building and I marked off the size of the tabernacle, and it was less than half of the size of our auditorium. And just to help people see, I mean, it literally, we could probably fit 4 tabernacles in this auditorium. They're not very large. Yes? Yeah. If you want to think about that, think about it that way. Yeah. And so that, I mean, again, that would not have been insignificant to those people the way it appears to us. But it also would not have been the largest thing they had ever seen. And so it kind of just put it now. That being said, it might have been the richest thing they've ever seen, which we'll see in just a moment. Okay. The windows had beveled frames, so there were windows in the temple. A lot of times, most drawings picture them around the top area of the temple, which would have let in light. It would have let out the smoke from the candlesticks and the incense and those types of things. There was a chambered structure along the temple wall encircling the temple. So there were basically, they're later called storehouses. So they were chambers all along the outside of the temple. There were side chambers all around. There were offset ledges so that nothing would be inserted in the temple wall. So I found that interesting. An interesting detail in Scripture is that while there were these chamber rooms around the temple, there was a space between the chamber rooms and the temple itself, because they did not want there to be anything to interfere with the temple. So it kind of gave a kind of a hedge around the temple itself so that there would be no desecration of the temple. So here's an artist rendering, I don't know how well y'all can see that, of maybe what the Solomon's temple could have looked like. You've got the bronze altar here. You've got the laver, which we'll talk about in a moment. You've got the water cart. But then you've got this temple structure here, and then around the temple, on the back side and on the sides, you've got these storehouses, and the storehouses would have been used to store things for temple service, or store the ones in the back that were attached to the most holy place were to store the treasures that were given to God, not necessarily the tithe, but the things that have been accumulated by the kings over the years. And so it's all of this where a lot of the wealth of the Israelites were stored that often got pillaged by invading armies and those types of things. And then just to give you a kind of a bird's eye view, this is what was in the top corner of that last picture, but here's essentially, some artist's best guess of what we're actually looking at when we're kind of crafting out what the temple floor plan would have been. So you've got the most holy place here, and then you've got the holy place, and this is what mostly mimics the tabernacle, and lets us see essentially what was around the tabernacle. And then you'll notice you've got this kind of space around that could have been a wall, could have been an actual space that was around the tabernacle. I tend to think there was a space in there because of the way that it's worded. But then you've got these actual storerooms around the outside of the tabernacle. Okay? So that's the basic structure that we have to help us understand what it was they were going to. Okay, any questions on that? Additions? Things I left out? No? All right, then we'll move on. Not only do you have the structure, but you have a lot of interesting finishes that are involved with the temple, and this is where the temple really shines, pun intended. It's where the temple really is seen to be an elaborate and amazing structure, is in the way that everything's finished. So it's planked with cedar on the inside walls. Now those get overlaid with gold in just a moment, but you've got, basically the entire thing it's kind of like shiplap. You've got shiplap walls. This is the first shiplap. Shiplap walls around the inside of the keep calling it tabernacle, inside of the temple, and then on the wood, you've got these carvings that are there, ornamental gourds and flower blossoms, and so it's not just straight wood, but it's very elaborately laid and decorated wood. And then the floors themselves were overlaid with cypress boards, and so you've got the actual stone floor. Then you have the wooden floors on top of that. And then everything is overlaid with gold. So it's not just wood. When you walk in, you are literally walking into a golden box. That would have been impressive. Okay? And not just a golden box. What do you have in there providing light? But candlesticks all over the place. And so you've got, this golden box lit up by firelight. That would have been impressive. Don't you think? Yes. Well, it was a step up for the priest workspace. I mean, they got a much improved work area compared to what they did have. Yes. So maybe we're all priests. So maybe one day when we get to heaven, we can have God duplicate it so we can see it. There's so much I want to see that I know I'm never going to get to see. So anyway, he overlaid the most holy place with gold. He overlaid the cedar altar. He overlaid the interior of the sanctuary with gold, hung gold chains across it near the doorway. He made, and these are interesting to me, he made 2 15-foot tall cherubim out of olive wood, and he put them in the inner temple and overlaid them with gold. So now we've got not just, what in the tabernacle you had a small square room with one piece of furniture. What was that piece of furniture? Ark of the Covenant. In the temple, you've got a larger room, but the one small little piece of furniture that is overshadowed by 2 very large cherubim statues, which makes me go, like there's a lot of this whole building thing that makes me kind of dance on my heels a little bit, going, I don't understand. But you've got these 2 large statues. I'm not saying they were wrong. Okay, Dallas? Yes. Yes. with the actual cherubim statues. Yes. And again, it's one of those, and maybe it's just me, but that whole thought process, I'm not saying it was wrong, because we're never told that it was wrong. But what do we also know they weren't supposed to do in the Ten Commandments? Make graven images of anything where? In heaven, on earth, or under the earth. And that just, we're never told it was wrong. But with Israel's history with idols, it makes me nervous. Okay, the whole idea makes me nervous. Yes. They did. So you've got cherubim on curtains. I don't know if they're on these curtains. They were on the tabernacle curtain. You got the 15-foot tall cherubim, and then you've got the small cherubim on top of the ark itself. It just, again, I'm probably completely out of place, but it still makes me, with their history, go, this is potentially dangerous. And to me, that's part of what makes this whole thing different. There's a lot of the whole temple design that is not spelled out by what God already commanded with the tabernacle. You know, we don't have the same sort of involvement of God in the temple as we do with the tabernacle, as far as I can tell. Maybe I'm missing something in there. And again, I think some of it is just replicated. Some of it is replicated and taken to the next level, like the curtain cherubim turning into actual statuary, or statues, not statuary, statues. And then, so anyway, I probably make too much of it. Carved surrounding the temple walls with engravings of cherubim and palm trees and blossoms again, and olive doors with carvings that are overlaid with gold. And all of this took 7 years. So it was quite a hefty project. I mean, you can imagine how much work and energy and resources went into this whole project. It's an impressive feat that Solomon is accomplishing. And again, from what we're told in Scripture, why does Solomon do it? Yeah, why does Solomon build the temple? Well, David wanted him to. God's response to David was what? I don't really care, but you're not going to do it. If anyone's going to do it, it'll be your son Solomon. Solomon does it, and from what we read in the story so far about Solomon, I think it's safe to say Solomon does it because he loves the Lord. There seems to very much be Solomon is very appreciative of the Lord and what the Lord has done in a lot of ways. And so, I don't think we're out of place in giving Solomon a right motivation in what he's doing. I don't think he is trying to change the law of the Lord or change God's plans because he wants to do what he wants to do instead of what God wants him to do. God, as far as we can tell, is fairly mute on this project. About his only command is David won't do it, Solomon will. Okay, but did God command that a temple be built for him? No, David came up with that idea. And so, it's interesting to me to see all of that. Now, God agrees with it. I'm not saying God was opposed to it, but really, David was the one who desired to do it. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I, again, God supports the building of the temple. Okay? I wonder if God wasn't just as supportive of put the ark back where it belongs and let's keep going. And again, we're not told a lot about God's perspective on this whole thing. And it is interesting to me some of the shifts and changes that Solomon makes when he gets to the temple, which we'll talk about in a moment. Yes. Yeah, keep going. Yeah. He says, when you get it done, you continue to walk in my ways, I will dwell there. So again, I'm in no way implying God is against the building of the temple, because we don't read that anywhere. Yeah, absolutely. So, yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting to me. I mean, you look later, while she was talking, it made me think of Acts 17 when Paul's talking to them in Athens, and he says, the God who made the world and everything in it, he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by hand, neither is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives everyone life and breath and all things. But that idea of, God doesn't need a temple. And God never says, I need a temple. And God never really commands the building of the temple. He allows it. He approves it. He moves in to show his presence with the people. What do we know he eventually does? He moves out because he's no longer pleased with the people. And that's a big, shameful moment in Israel's history. And so part of this, I think, is to recognize, I personally feel that a lot of what's going on here is not God, this stuff being built because God wanted it. It's being built because it was the people's way of showing he is our God and we're going to treat him special. And that's not in and of itself not a bad thing. Nancy. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Dallas? Yeah. 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 Rex? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and that's where, I think God has always desired to have a place to dwell with his people. And that's from the very beginning. From the very beginning, God had a place where he met with his people. Where was it? The garden. As soon as he called a family, I mean, you've got the tabernacle, then you've got the temple, then you've got today the church. God has always, in some form or fashion, sought to dwell with his people. My difficulty with the temple is that God already had a place to dwell with his people, didn't he? I mean, had they put the ark back in the tabernacle, we're back to exactly what God commanded, as Dallas said earlier. And by the time you get to the return from captivity, where's the tabernacle? It's been disassembled. It's gone. And so at that point, there needs to be a dwelling place for God in the center of his people. That I don't think exists at this point. But again, I don't want to make a mountain out of a molehill. Here, God is approving this plan, and God has let this plan be put in place, and God has, every step of the way, God gave the craftsman's ability. You see God's hand in the whole crafting of this temple. So there's a lot in which God is doing this and piecing it together and supporting the plan. Yes, Meredith? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. And again, I think Solomon is doing the right thing in doing all of this. He's following his father's orders. He's following this plan that is uh, God is involved with in some way. He's gathering all this stuff. It was been a huge project and undertaking, and he does it all. I mean, this is another artist rendering of what the maybe a cross section of the temple would have looked like. There's lots of different pieces that were involved, like the brazen altar there. It would have been a large structure in front of the temple. You could have thrown a lot of animals on there, right? I mean, look at the animal down there, number 2, and how many of those could have fit up there on that large surface area of of the brazen altar, it's pretty impressive what what they could do. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. Wow. Yeah. I mean that just to put this in perspective, that's impressive. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, so this artist just didn't pay attention. Um, the sea, it's sometimes called, or the bronze basin or laver outside. It would have been a massive laver, 15 feet across, held more than 10,000 gallons of water. So it would have been like medium-sized above-ground pool. Give you an idea of how big that thing would have been. It stood on the back of 12 bronze oxen that held it up underneath. You've got the brass pillars out front. One of them was named Jachin, which means he will establish, and the other one's name is Boaz, meaning in him is strength. They would have been 27 feet tall, so large pillars out front, kind of holding up the front portico of the temple itself. Keep going here. You got the holy place, and again, I don't know how much carving was on the wall. We don't know how large the carvings were. Were they all small blossoms, or were they massive blossoms carved into the wall? I really don't know. It's anyone's guess. You've got the golden lampstands and the table of showbread, 10 of them, made for the temple. And so you would have had a lot of candles flickering in there, lighting up the holy place, and all the golden walls that would have reflected that would have been very pretty. In my opinion, the little bit that I can picture it, imagine the shadows playing on the actual carvings, and it would have looked like things were moving around in there. It would have been a pretty impressive thing to witness. But as Dallas, or not Dallas, as my brain is skipping. Larry said that we wouldn't have seen it anyway. So, golden incense altar. So you've got the golden the incense working. Now, what do you notice different about what's outside and what's inside? Everything outside was overlaid with what? Bronze. Everything inside is overlaid with gold. It seems that the closer you get God's presence, the nicer things get. And I don't think that is by accident. That's to give honor and glory to God because he deserves it. You got the veil. They are separating the holy place and the most holy place. And then inside you've got these 15-foot tall cherubim. That would have been impressive. We don't really know what cherubim look like. So that's this artist's best guess. We have a description of seraphim in Scripture, but we don't really have a description of cherubim that I can remember. Maybe I'm wrong on that. But it is interesting to see. I don't know if they would have, as Dallas pointed out earlier, maybe they were to mimic the cherubim on the veil itself. Maybe they were to mimic the ones on the actual ark. And from what I can tell, the ones on the ark probably would not have looked like what we typically think they look like. The ones on the ark, we tend to picture, at least all the kids' drawings that I've seen, show the cherubim kind of bowing towards each other and the wings touching in the middle, both wings touching. Most scholars think at this point that probably the ark, instead of being carried the way we often picture it, where the poles went down the long side of the ark, and so it would have been carried the skinny way. That makes sense. It would have been, the poles would have been on the short side of it, and it would have been carried wide. And the purpose of the cherubim, 2 wings in the back would have touched like this, and the other wing would have gone forward, and it would have mimicked a seat, or mimicked a litter that you would carry a king on. And so the idea when they would carry it in the battle was they were carrying their God before them, and their God was sitting on his seat. That was the place where he would sit, or he would rest his feet, and it was literally carrying their invisible God into battle. And again, that's just best guess based on what we know from archaeology, what other tribes and other places had, and mimicking the ideas that are talked about in Scripture. So I don't know if the cherubim here were just statues of these heavenly beings, or if they were mimicking what was on the actual tabernacle, Ark of the Covenant. We really just don't have a ton of room. And then you've got the storehouses that were around the temple, and then the ones in the back around the most holy place would have been, storing the treasures that were given through time. Okay, and then you've got in chapter 7 a description of the other buildings that Solomon built. So he had a whole structure of buildings built essentially for himself, or for his purposes. You've got the house of the forest of Lebanon. Okay, most people think maybe that is where Hiram would come and stay. Hiram came and stayed and helped build all the utensils and things like that, because he was apparently quite a impressive craftsman himself. Being, you associate Hiram from Lebanon, and he builds a temple or a palace called the house of the forest of Lebanon. Maybe it was a friendly gesture for Hiram. The hall of the thrones, which is where he would give out judgments as a king. You've got Solomon's own palace, and then you've got the similar palace that he built for Pharaoh's daughter. And so he built all of these. Each of these were 150 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet tall, which interestingly is about twice the size of the temple. I'm not necessarily making any judgment about that, but it is interesting that here Solomon has 4 massive structures built for his purposes, and then there's the one smaller structure for God. So if you look at that from a building standpoint, this is David's city, or Jerusalem during the time of David. As far as we can tell here, you've got the David's palace up here, which was fairly small, and then you've got Mount Moriah up top. When you get to the time of Solomon, the city's built up a little bit. I don't know if you can tell the difference there. It's almost double the size, right? But up on top of the mount, you've got, let me go back. You've got Solomon's temple here, Solomon's palaces. You see how it kind of all surrounds the temple itself. But look at the difference there between the sizes of what's available for Solomon and what's available for God. You still have David's palace down here, which Dallas pointed out a year ago was likely, they think, used more as a hall of records. It's where they would go and store all of the information, where the secretaries would work. It became more of an administrative building than an actual dwelling place. Solomon built city walls. You've got just a lot of building up of the city itself. That was a part of what Solomon did. So kind of zooming in, that you've got the house of the forest of Lebanon, Solomon's temple, Solomon's palace. In there you've got the Pharaoh's daughter's palace. There's quite a bit of building that went on. I show you all of this not because I want to, again, diminish the role of Solomon and what his character and what he did, but to help you understand when that much has changed in one king's reign, you can understand why the people feel burdened and taxed and worn out. By the time Solomon dies and Rehoboam takes his place, which we're going to cover pretty soon, it makes perfect sense why the people were exhausted and why the people asked for relief. I mean, their capital city has doubled in size, and a large portion of the growth of their city, if you remember, I mean, look at David's city and where it ends, right there at David's palace. By the time you get to Solomon's city, it's doubled in size, and about half of what's doubled belongs to Solomon, right? Now, could you imagine if we had a president who said the White House isn't big enough, we're going to turn it into an administrative building, and I'm going to take this quadrant of the city and build myself a house that's going to take the whole quadrant? Could you imagine how we'd feel about that? I mean, it's one of those, I mean, these people are human. I mean, they're going to notice this kind of thing. And again, I don't think they begrudge Solomon. They considered Solomon a great king, but it doesn't mean that they don't also feel burdened and taxed and worn out by the time all of this is completed. Does that make sense? Yes? No? Okay. So, all right, we'll keep going real quick because I got 2 minutes left. You've also got this section where it talks about the bronze water carts that were created in order to bring water that would rest 5 on each side of the temple. You've got bronze basins with utensils, again, set up on the sides of the temple. And everything is brought into the temple when it's completed. And we know when everything's done, we don't cover, I think we cover it Wednesday night, Solomon's dedication. What happens at the end of the dedication? God moves in. So apparently everything that is done in a way that honors and respects God. So chapters 8 and 9 for Wednesday, and we'll continue on with Solomon's story. So.